I'm so glad so many of you came back this evening. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to function preaching this sermon without having Boyce get up and preach half of it before I get there. Can you tell that kind of bugs me? I don't know, maybe it's not a big thing. It's good to see everybody here this afternoon. It was especially good to hear that great, I had tenor over here and Daniel leading, and I hear this great bass coming over in this direction. Was that you, Ray? No, okay. Anyway, it was coming from over there, sounded good. It's always nice to hear that. I am fortunate to be able to sit here and listen to Pete on one side and Daniel on the other normally, and I get that stereo effect of tenor. It's really nice. But it's good to see everyone here this evening. I'm going to point out three rather disjointed points about Solomon in this text here. And these things are written for our learning and admonition. And so these are three quick devotionals that you could stick together and make a sermon out of, and that's basically what I've done. It's not that they're non-related. They are, because they're about the same guy in his life and what was going on in his life. However, there are unique features about a person who is incredibly wise. And we have Proverbs to show for it in one case, Song of Solomon in another, and then we have Ecclesiastes, which almost sounds like the rantings of a bitter old man that didn't live his life like he should have. And to some degree, we're going to understand kind of how that worked and why it is in his wisdom. He wrote Ecclesiastes understanding that this is the whole matter, as he wrote at the end, chapter 13, 12. Fear God, keep his commandments. That's it. This is what it's all about. You would have thought, because of the way he started, that it would have been something like that. But in this context, we find, and my first point is that Solomon had his little bit of flaws. Now, we're going to point out his humility in a minute. It's unbelievable. Wish everybody had that, could copy that. But to start with, let's understand that the first thing we read about, well, we didn't read about it because I spared Ray a couple of 2 or 3 verses there. The first couple of verses, Solomon makes a treaty and marries this gal from Egypt, okay? Now, we understand the Israelites were not supposed to marry outside the Israelite tribes, and so right off the bat, King Solomon stumps his toe, and by the way, some of that would come back later to bite him, as he had, I can't remember the exact numbers, I always get it mixed up, 600 wives and 400 concubines, or concubines, or something like that. But nevertheless, he had tons and tons of women folk around the house, and what you can understand from that is basically very often, this is the case, chapter 3, verse 1, he ended up with a spouse because he made a treaty with some country so that they wouldn't fight with each other. But the upshot is, he had some issues because in chapter 3, verse 3, Solomon loved the Lord. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that you can love the Lord even in your imperfections, okay? This Bible teaches us that right here in this verse. He loved the Lord. He was walking in the statutes of his father David. We know David was a man after his own, God's own heart. David was therefore perfect? No, David was not perfect. He made mistakes. So this shouldn't be a surprise. But you'll notice that he walked in the statutes of his father David, except. That's a massive word in the middle of that sentence, implying, of course, that, yep, Solomon was not perfect. There were some things he missed, which is kind of ironic because I don't believe he learned that from his father. You'll notice further down there, Solomon said in verse 6, "You have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father." Solomon had seen his father and all of the stuff that David, or most of the stuff David had gone through after his birth, and understood David wasn't a perfect man, but he understood that he walked before God in truth and righteousness and the uprightness of his heart. And so Solomon did not learn how to be perfect, okay? We're all trying to work at that. But what he did learn is that there has to be an inner person who is dedicated to God. And what comes next is just stunning, coming from an individual who, unlike Josiah, who was 9 years old when he took over and really had somebody else running the country, or like Saul, who was just embarrassed and hid himself before he was appointed. No, Solomon was ready to take over as king, okay? It talks about him being, he makes the statement, "I'm a little child and don't know how to come out and go in." That is a euphemistic statement, a figurative statement, okay? In Psalm 90 and 10, David talked about, you know, you get 60 years, or 70 years, and possibly you get 10 more, 80 years. So you get a few years on this earth. But when David died, he was an old man and he had reigned for 40 years. Well, you find out from 1 Kings 11, chapter 11, verse 42, Solomon also reigned for 40 years. And besides, if he was a young boy, he would have probably had Rehoboam when he was about 11 or 12 years old. And that doesn't wash either. So he's talking about this figuratively, but the humility that he has is overwhelming, and this is the second lesson that we can learn from Solomon. Yes, God will love us even when we're not perfect, but what he does expect of us is a heart that is soft and pliable and understands its position when it comes to God. And so he says in verse 9, therefore give your servant an understanding heart, because I'm not capable on my own of leading this great people. And so several things can be pointed out very quickly. I just want to point out a couple. Number one, his humility. Give your servant. His humility was such that he understood and recognized he was God's servant, even if he was king. And what he needed was the capacity to discern between good and evil. We look at our culture today, and there's so much compromise. The motivator is, or not the motivator, but the mechanism is always semantics. Change the terminology, redefine your terms, and you can get away with nearly anything, can you not? There is such a gray line between right and wrong anymore in our culture. If anyone is going to express to our culture what is right and what is wrong, it's going to be us through our words and through our life. That's the only way this world is going to figure out what's right and wrong, because they certainly aren't reading their Bible. So therefore, he wanted to know the difference, and then he comes back with the fact, who is going to judge this great people of yours? He understood that he may be king, but these are God's people. I wish more leaders in the church today, and many of the churches I've been in, and some that I have heard about and read about, that leaders in the church recognize that their leadership, not dictatorship, but leadership is such that they are leading God's people. I get up every time I preach. I have a prayer before I do so. And I pray that I say the right things, the things that will motivate, the things that will encourage, make people better than what they used to be. But I want to do that because these are God's people. And I don't know about you, and I can't speak for Boyce and Barry, but I'll guarantee you, when you get up in front of God's people, and that's on your mind, it's a little bit humbling. Okay, it's a lot humbling. Because I don't want somebody to do the wrong thing and stand at the judgment of Christ and say, well, Jeff said, in fact, I encourage you highly, don't do that. Test me. Be sure that what I've said is right, correct. And so therefore, he is to be commended strongly because he wanted to do the right thing, and he understood God was the one from whom he would get it. The final thing is in verse 14. And I went over again this morning, so I'm not going to stress this one out at all. In verse 14. There are always conditions. I don't understand why it is the case. That's a soprano, I'm telling you. I can tell it's a soprano. Look at verse 14. In a covenant, in an arrangement of any kind with someone, in an agreement, there's always two parties. I'm stunned that people struggle with the distinction between the old covenant and the new covenant, trying still to go under the Ten Commandments. And yet at the same time, listen to Jesus, who gave us two, that sum up the old Ten Commandments and try to obey both. You can't. In a covenant, there are two parties, and in those two parties, both have something to contribute. And that's the fallacy of Calvinism. Calvinism says God does it all. You do nothing. Doesn't matter what you do. You have nothing to do that has anything to do with your salvation. The falseness of that negates the definition of covenant. Covenant is made between two people. When God made a covenant with Abraham, he made a deal with Abraham, and Abraham had to follow through. And he did. He got up, he left the Ur of the Chaldees, Hebrews tells us, not even knowing where he went. Okay, he had faith in God, he did his part. If you don't do your part, you can't expect God to do his part. He's not going to breach the covenant. We do. And so therefore, he says in verse 14, if you walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. The conditional statements of the Bible are just so numerous, it's almost beyond count. It is amazing how many times God tells us, this is what I give to you, my grace. I give to you my love. I give to you my hope. I give to you. But I give them to you if. There is always connected with anything that God gives us an if. Even the free gift of grace. And free only tells us that it's not something I can earn. And so we understand from Luke 17:10 that we don't earn our salvation after we have done all that we've been told to do. Then we approach God and say we're unworthy servants because we can't work our way to heaven. And the idea that people think we work our way to heaven because we're baptized is absurd. We have to understand that there are conditions that have to be completed in order for us to go to heaven. Finally, in verse 15, his response to this was to say thank you to God. You'll notice how he did that. He awoke, he knew it was a dream, but he came to Jerusalem. Now I want you to notice the contrast from when he started out, because he was up on the high places, verse 2, where people sacrificed, and he's up there in verse 4 at Gibeon to sacrifice up in the high places. That wasn't authorized, okay? So when he had this dream, when God spoke to him and said, ask what you want, I'm going to give it to you. In fact, he was very pleased with Solomon's response and said, I'm going to give you way more than what you thought. By the way, that's something that we need to consider. If you'll just ask God for the blessings that he bestows on us, he'll give you way more than you can handle. Trust me, he will. That's what he says he'll do. He challenged those in Malachi, through Malachi, try me. You do what I tell you to do. You sacrifice like I tell you to do, and see if I don't bless you. More than you can imagine. I believe a lot of our struggles in life are self-inflicted. All this stuff that happens, time and chance, happens to us all. I understand that. But a great deal of it is because we thought we had a better idea, and we don't. And so therefore his thank you was he went back to Jerusalem, and he stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and there offered up burnt offerings. I would assume from the text that he's probably doing it the right way, because everything else about the text of the scripture is about the right way of doing things. He went back and he worshiped God. Now, you can go on with the life of him, of Solomon. In fact, the next section is just a sermon all by itself when he said, let's cut this baby in half and give a piece to each mama, and his wisdom went throughout the land. God obviously answered his question, and gave him the blessings he promised him to. But you can go on through Solomon, and Solomon has quite a colorful life. But he was incredibly wise. But here's the kicker to it. You can see from this context that he wasn't perfect. And when you read Ecclesiastes, the most brilliant thing he says of the whole thing, with all of the vanity that life is, that he has discovered, yes, this life is vanity. We're living for the next life, folks. That's what it's about. And that's what he says the conclusion to this wise man is, fear God and keep his commandments. That's the whole thing. I can't leave you with a better bit of advice than this wise man did in saying, if you want to be right with God, fear God, keep his commandments. And you'll notice that those two things run in tandem. They're not one and separate from the other. They're in tandem. They're both together. If we want to be godly people, we need to have some of these characteristics that Solomon had, and the others, we need to learn the lessons that Solomon learned without having to experience them ourselves. But we need to understand that it's all about serving God. If you're not a Christian, we offer an invitation. If you are a Christian, we offer that invitation for you to change your life. Won't you stand as we sing?